Good evening, everyone. My name is Dawn. Thank you for joining this webinar brought to you by ASQ Innovation Division. The topic of tonight's webinar is sustainable quality. Times have changed and the concept of using quality as a competitive advantage has been diminished or even lost completely. Quality only becomes a competitive advantage when it's embraced by the entire company. It is not that there is a lack of quality improvement models. There are many available, such as ISO, Baldrige, Total Quality Management, Lean Six Sigma, to name a few. While all these models have been successful, the world has changed dramatically since the models were introduced. Why do many improvement efforts seem to fizzle out? Why are they not sustainable? The learning objectives are quality models, old and new, connection between culture and quality leadership, creating sustainable success. This webinar is being recorded and the recording will be available on ASQ Innovation Division YouTube channel. In addition, there will be 10-minute time after the presentation for questions and answers. You can post your questions in the Q&A section of the WebEx too. Tonight, our speaker is Mr. Joseph Daly. Joseph Daly is a senior quality management professional with more than 30 years of experience in small and large technology companies. He is an influential leader with extensive background in the engineering disciplines of quality, reliability, and testing. Joe's proven strengths include analysis, problem solving, and management. He is known for driving positive change and improving quality. Joe has been on the cutting edge of new methods and practices and has consistently raised the level of maturity in the organizations where he has worked. Throughout his career, Joe has been well recognized for leading transformative change and building high-performing teams. His interests include developing creative solutions for systematic problems, continuous improvement, and examining culture as it pertains to quality and operational performance. Joe has a BS in Information Systems and MS in Management with an emphasis in leading change. Joe is also certified as a Lean Six Sigma Black Belt. Thank you very much, Joe, for accepting to be our speaker today. Without further ado, I would like to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dawn. And I wanted to thank you and Tracy for this opportunity. I really appreciate this. And I think we'd go ahead and get started here. So again, my name is Joseph Daly. I was talking about my book called Sustainable Quality. I think we'll just kind of go over some of the highlights from the book, and hopefully you'll find this interesting. I thought it might be good to start out with a definition of quality. I think and as quality professionals, I think there's lots of definitions of quality. But I thought, if we look at a more simplistic view of quality, it's really just a level of awareness between a good or a bad product. But as quality professionals, we're probably more accustomed to the definition of meeting customer expectations. And for me, I think that means not only do you understand what your customer needs, but also what they expect, and that's not always the same thing. But then I think there's a deeper definition. I think there's a kind of an essence of quality, and that's more of an internal personal drive toward perfection. And I think the question is, how do you get your workforce to that place? And I think that's a little bit more about what we'll be covering tonight. So maybe we start by talking about the impact of quality. The impact of quality is kind of based on the concept that doing things right the first time is always cheaper than doing things over. And I think these improvements are achieved by eliminating the cost of doing things over, such as fixing mistakes and fixing errors and problems and removing waste. And I think there's also a piece of this that's tied to profitability, but that by improving your quality, you're increasing the value, you're providing greater value to your customers. I think the other piece that's important, I think, in terms of quantifying the impact is cost of quality. And again, I know I'm talking to a bunch of quality professionals. So just a quick view of this is that there's 4 categories for cost of quality that roll up into the total cost of quality. There's prevention costs, and that's really the costs associated with preventing problems. So like training, doing design reviews, and designing for manufacturing. Those things help prevent quality issues. And then there's the appraisal costs, which really are somebody checking somebody else's work, right? And those are things like inspection, testing, and audits. There's internal failure costs, and these are the failures that are caught before the product or service goes to a customer. And then there's external failure costs, which are the costs associated with the customer actually finds the problem. So why is that important? I think if you could consider this, think about how much you could save if you did everything right the first time. If you knew that everything was right, you wouldn't need to spend time on inspecting or re-inspecting, making design changes, making bug fixes, testing products or retesting products because they had an issue. So these things start to add up in both in time and money. And then you also wouldn't need dedicated staff that handles irate customers or complaints about poor service or dealing with return products. So I think the bottom line for this is that companies that do not measure the cost of poor quality, and these are the failure costs that we talked about, they could be spending as much as 40% of their sales on poor quality activities. That means 2 days per week you're redoing work that wasn't done right the first time. So think about how much you could save if you could cut that down to 1 day per week, or 4 hours per week, or even an hour per week. I thought a real life example might be helpful. I worked at a large company where we implemented a cost of quality program. And we primarily were focusing on the cost of poor quality and trying to understand what that was costing us. And so one particular issue we had, it was a problem that affected many of our big customers, our biggest customers, in fact. And so we started to track all the costs associated with that problem. And so we captured all the man-hour times for meetings that we spent talking about it. And, this was time that the engineering teams were spending on troubleshooting the problem and trying to get to a root cause, times that the engineering teams were trying to figure out a fix. So all these times we started to capture and put kind of a cost associated, and that was about $300,000. Then there was all the logistics costs of customers returning product that was not working and us shipping out new products. And so when we accumulated all those costs, because most of that stuff was expedited, so it cost even more. And so that was around $200,000. But the real impact was the cost of lost sales. And so because of these problems, the customer lost faith in us and decided to go with somebody else. And so these are customers that either had recently placed orders and then canceled them, or were about to place orders and pulled them back. And that ended up costing about $10 million. So for this one problem, it cost the company $11 million. And so I put in the cost on here. I presented this information to an executive team, and we immediately got called to an all managers meeting to talk about this, and literally stood there until 8 o'clock that night. When the executive team was wanting corrective action put in place so this would never happen again. So I think we would have dealt with the issues anyway, but the fact that we put a dollar cost on there, and it was such a big dollar cost, we got immediate action because we had measured the cost of what the cost of that poor quality for that one problem. So I want to talk a little bit about quality models, both something that will be familiar to all of you, and then maybe something new. And so again, I know the audience that I'm talking to, these are not new to you, but I did want to just highlight them because it kind of set the basis for what we're going to be talking about. So there's ISO 9000, and I know there's other certifications in quality management systems, and this is often viewed as say what you do and do what you say. And I think the key thing about the ISO certification is that it conveys to customers that you've met a tangible standard, and so that's recognizable. I think statistical process control is not so much a model, but it is a best practice to monitor and manage your processes. Poor quality management is where everybody in the company is responsible for quality. It's not just one. It's not assigned to one quality team, and they're expected to be responsible for quality. So I think it's the idea of is it's supposed to be everybody's responsible for quality, and there's an emphasis on problem prevention. Six Sigma, along with Lean, is probably the most widely used model today. And Six Sigma was initially targeted for reducing defects in the manufacturing process, but today it's used across all different industries. And then similarly, Lean was also came out in the manufacturing process, but it's focused on the emphasis on seeking out and eliminating waste, and it also is being used in many different industries now besides manufacturing. So these models all have pros that we kind of just touched on. They also have some areas that are cons. So like with ISO 9000 and QMS, there's some structure there and some documentation, but it can be overdone. Sometimes that when it starts to get too much documentation, that can be met with resistance. SPC obviously is very helpful in statistical control of a process, but it requires some knowledge of statistics. TQM, as we mentioned, is a company-wide view of quality where everybody's responsible, but it requires strong leadership and to get that company-wide buy-in. Six Sigma is a very good tool for reducing variation, but it tends to be a little bit more tactical than TQM does, so it's not quite as strategic. And then Lean obviously is very good for removing and improving efficiency, removing waste and improving efficiency, but it has a narrow focus on waste. That narrow focus on waste does not always address all the quality issues. So here's what was surprising to me when I was doing some research for this book is that these models have been around for a while. You can just see some of the years that they were created. And so I guess the point I wanted to make here is that even though these models have been around for a while and are widely used, it's been three decades since we've introduced a new model. So just think about how much change has happened over the last 30 years, and just look at the change that we've dealt with over this last year. So I guess my question is, do you think we're about ready to take a look at a new approach to quality? So I've got a short video that I wanted to play for you. And it was actually developed by my business partner, David Wood. It's pretty short. It's only a couple of minutes long, but I hope it'll set the tone for what we're going to talk about moving into a new approach. So thank you for sitting through that. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope it'll help set the stage for what we're about to cover. So as we mentioned, all of these models provide value, and most of them have been around for a long time, and they're still being used to some degree. But the fact is that many improvement efforts fizzle out over time. So what is missing? Why does that happen? And I think the issue is that you need to have the right culture for improvement. Improvement is not change, and I think you have to have a culture that's ready to embrace that change. I think you need to have a shared vision for quality. If it's done in little pockets, I think it's tough to see the big picture. And then it's really important, I think, that you use the right tools in training. I think as quality professionals, we tend to latch on to something that we're familiar with, and start to be less flexible as we get tied into one methodology. So I think we need to understand that one size does not fit all. We need to understand the situation, and just locking in and using only one model for everything reminds me of an old saying: if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So we don't want to be in that mode. I think we want to be more flexible and really understand what the needs are, and choose the right methods and tools to fit the needs. So I'd like to introduce a new approach to you. This is the sustainable quality model, and I think it really starts with building a really solid foundation of quality, a culture of quality. I think that's the most important piece before you can start to build on that. And so once you have that culture of quality, then I think you need to start to look at your strategy. What is your strategy? And by that I mean your vision, your goals, what metrics are you going to put in place? And then I think you need to look at, based on your direction you're going with your strategy, I think then you can start to look at the tools, methods, and training that help you reach your goals and vision. So we can take a little bit deeper dive into each one of these. Well, again, why a new approach? I think if the culture is not ready, it really does not matter what methodology you use. And I've been in situations, and that's what really started to have me think about this. I've been in situations where we got thrust into using a certain methodology for quality improvement, and the culture was a mess. And so when you're in a difficult or toxic environment, the last thing you're thinking about is improving your process or improving a product. So I think you need to fix the culture first before you start fixing processes and products. So I think getting to a place where people will take pride in the company and they feel a sense of belonging, I think that's when you can start to talk about putting an improvement program in place. So I think the key point here is that culture is fundamental to any sustainable change. So let's look at that bottom tier one, building a quality culture. What is a culture? I think there's a number of factors that go into making up a culture. You look at what type of company you have, and what the size of the company is, and what the history of the company is. I think it's important to understand the business environment and maybe the maturity of the company. I think it certainly is important to understand the leadership and the management style and the communication style of your leaders. And then you need to understand the workforce piece of it, and then the attitudes and values of the people that are in the workforce, and does that match with the company values? So we've talked a bit into more of a definition here. The definition is it's a set of shared values, goals, and attitudes and practices that characterize an organization. But I think the real key point here is that it's about the way people feel about the work they do, the values they believe in, and how those match with the company values, and where they see the company going, and the role that they have in helping it get there. And we'll come back to that. That's an important piece there. But I think the key point here is that culture happens, right? Either unintentionally or intentionally. So you could just let the culture happen, and it's usually driven by some of the more dominant personalities that are in your company, or you could intentionally create the culture you want. And so I think that's one of the things we're really going to be talking about here is how do you create the culture that you want. So this is kind of a look at the traditional old culture. Now this is kind of the culture where some of these models were developed. This is more of the traditional culture then. And where we want to go now, I think, is more of a quality culture. So going from more of a hierarchical style to a participative style, a functional focus to a process focus. You know, short-term planning versus really a vision for the future. So, I mean, you could read through these, but I think a key point is we need to be more about the people and less about the things. Well, let's talk about leadership for a little bit and how that plays a role in creating this culture. So I believe today that there is a management problem in America. And there's plenty of studies out here. This just cites one of them. But there, so many of America's managers today have not received any formal training on management. So in a sense, they really do not know what they know. They do not know what they don't know about leading people. So, you know, some of the studies show that, you know, 42% of the managers admit they learned how to manage by observing and mimicking a previous manager. So what if that previous manager was not a good manager? So this starts to build into a problem that I think we really need to look at. How do we address this and start to get people trained on how to manage people instead of just managing things? And so some of the managers report that they just are too busy with administrative or technical tasks to adequately oversee their teams. And so I think this happens when people are promoted to the ranks, and often it's, I come from technology companies, and often that happens because you have a really strong technical person and they ultimately take over as manager of that team, even though they haven't had any management experience or management training. So I think we need to take that into consideration as we're trying to develop the culture that we want, and people need to understand how to manage people. So let's look at what the impact is of someone that is a poor manager or an untrained manager, and what that impact could have on culture. So while we're looking at these, I'd like you to kind of see if any of these resonate with you in places that you've worked. Did you realize that most people quit their boss more so than they quit their job? That means the person that they're working directly for, they either dislike or distrust, and they'll leave the company because they just can't work for that person. We talked about the toxic environment and harassment. You know, if you're dealing and living every day in a toxic environment, like I mentioned before, the last thing you're thinking about is implementing an improvement program. You're just really focusing on trying to get out of that situation as fast as you can. So the other part is people, and I've worked at some small companies, and this is a common problem where people are overworked. So it's perfectly reasonable to expect some overtime occasionally, but if it occasionally turns into routine, then you're starting to burn people out. You think about the situations where there's just a complete lack of vision and direction, at least from the workforce perspective. Maybe the executive team knows where they're going, but the workforce doesn't. So how they contribute to the overall vision, they have no idea. So micromanaging is another thing that you see in technology companies, where we'll tell you how to do it and when to do it, and before too long, people just stop thinking, and you lose all creativity from your workforce. So these are things that managers have an influence on that could really have a direct impact on your culture. I know this is a little bit hard to read, and I think the slides will be going out, or at least part of the video, and you can read this a little closer. But I just wanted to highlight some key points of what the impact is of a negative culture. And again, there's lots of research on this, and I just pulled some things in just from the research I was doing. So, for example, it costs on average $14,000 per employee in lost productivity when you're working in a negative environment. Engagement is something that's now just starting to get a lot of visibility, and in fact, the Quality Progress this month's Quality Progress had some really good articles on culture and engagement. But it's pretty astonishing to think that 63% of the workforce is not engaged at work. That means they're showing up, they're doing things, but they're not fully engaged in their job. Yeah. And probably a really big sign that tells you that you have a culture issue is your turnover rate. And if it's truly approaching 48%, you know you have a culture problem. Now, conversely, look at the impact of a positive culture. Just going from a negative culture to a positive culture can result in like a 19% increase in operating income or a 20% increase in earnings, and go from as high as a 48% turnover rate down to 14%. So it's not only that it makes it better for the people, having a good culture just makes business sense. So let's look at a difference between the leader and the manager. And while you're kind of looking through these, I wanted to just tell you a short story. So as Don mentioned, I actually went to graduate school and got a master's in management. So this program, at the time, when everybody was going out and getting MBAs, I thought this program was really unique because it really focused on leadership and managing change and leading change. And so it was really a good program for me. I really enjoyed it. But one of the nights in class, a professor came out and handed everybody about an 8-inch piece of string. And he said, okay, I want you to straighten the string out perpendicular to you. And now, so everybody straightened out the string. And then he says, I want you to take the end closest to you, and I want you to push that string across the desk. Now, if you could visualize this, the string went everywhere but straight, right? He just quietly sat there and watched us as everybody struggled to move that string anywhere near toward the end of the desk. And so he let us struggle for a few minutes, and then he said, okay, stop. Now straighten out the string again. Now I want you to take the opposite end away from you, and now I want you to lead that string across the desk. So of course we were able to just grab the end of the string and just pull it right to the end of the desk. So he said the point of this exercise is that it's much more productive to lead than it is to push. And that little exercise has just stood with me as I've gone through leadership roles, that leading is more productive than pushing people. So the book will go into this in a little bit deeper, but I wanted to just do some highlights of transforming a culture and what it takes. So I think you start by assessing your culture, right, and understanding where you're at. I think, as I mentioned earlier, understanding what your turnover rate is a very good place to start. Even for small companies, I've seen really high turnover rates. And so you need to understand why people are leaving. And I think that's a really critical data point, that you need to capture that as people are leaving and try to really understand why. And then I think there's a number of different kinds of assessments. You could do surveys, you could do roundtables with smaller groups, you could do one-on-ones. But I think gathering some actual data, especially if it's anonymous and people could speak freely, I think it's really important to understand what are their issues and why do they feel like it's a negative environment. And then I think you simply just need to, as a leader, you just need to observe and watch people and how they act, and I think that's important to do that, especially in bigger companies at all different levels, because the type of culture that you may have at an executive level may not be the same kind of culture that you have at a workforce level. And so I think it's important to understand how that changes as it goes up to the executive level. And then improving the culture, I think it's important to start with meaningful values. And I don't mean something that goes into a PowerPoint presentation or something you put on your website. I mean real values that are important to the leaders of this company and something that you really feel like you could stand behind. So I think you really need to put some thought in what those values are. And then I think you need to help people understand their roles and responsibilities. As I mentioned, you need to understand how they're helping you achieve your goals. Otherwise, when there's not that connection, it's hard to buy into what you're doing. And then I think you need to enable them, empower them, coach them, and just really help them be successful, right? As leaders, you're going to be successful if they're successful. So make them successful. And then maintaining the culture is the hardest part, I think. And so I think to do this, I think you build the elements of your culture into your performance reviews and really measure people on it and and tell them when they're not meeting those expectations. So if you have certain values that you're trying to embody with the culture, if they're not demonstrating those values, you need to let them know and help them correct that. I also think it needs to be in your recruiting and interview process. Too often I've seen where everything on the interview process is about technical skills, and we don't look at what the impact of the culture is or the fit into the culture. So if you have a good culture, you want people coming in there, and you don't want them to disrupt that. You want them to fit into that. So I think you need to understand that there's a balance between technical skills and cultural skills and people skills, and you need to have that built into your interview and recruiting process. And then I think as leaders, you need to have tough love, right? When people step out of line and they really are not following those values, you need to hold them accountable. You need to reel them back in and not just let that go, because that's what starts to change the culture. So I think you need to hold them accountable, and then as leaders, you need to really walk the talk and live those values and demonstrate them and set the example for how we want people to act in this company. So my final thoughts on quality and culture, I a few thoughts here from Stephen Covey. He's one of my favorite authors. And of course, he's most known for his 7 Habits book, but he's also written a number of good books. But he also wrote some articles about quality and people and how the two tie together. And so these are some of his thoughts on that. But the piece that really, I think, really stays with me is that he made a key point about you can hire the hands and back of people, but they volunteer their minds and hearts. So I think if you get your culture to a point where people are volunteering their minds and hearts, then I think you have a quality culture. So let's talk a little bit about strategy. We're going to jump to the next tier on the model. And I know this is a little bit busy, but I think it's important to have a strategy for what you're doing, not only from a sense of direction, but from a sense of communication and having people understand where you're going. So I think, on the next layer down, it talks about shared vision. I think you need to understand what the future state looks like, and then certainly you need to understand your current state and what your current reality is, and then you can start to bridge the gap between your current state and your future state. So we take a closer look at those. I think the future state is where you want to be, and I think you need to create an inspiring picture of the future. I mean, just tell them they want to do this. If you don't inspire them, how do you expect them to follow you? So I think you need to create a picture or a vision for them that says, okay, I get it, that's where we're going. And then I think it needs to be a stretch, but you can't make it such a stretch that it's not realistic. And so it's got to be believable to people. So I think you want to make it a stretch, but be realistic and achievable. And then I think you need to understand what's important to your business. That's what sets your vision, right? Whether it's improving customer satisfaction or reducing time to market, reducing operational costs, whatever your business needs are, that's what you need to put into your future state and try to build a plan around that. And of course, setting a baseline on your current state, and you need to be honest with yourself. You may not be close when you start out, but be honest where you're at today. What's working? What's not working? Why is it not working? What measurements are in place? And you need to understand what can be measured and what is not measured that you should be measuring. So start to put together a baseline of where you're at, and now you kind of understand what that gap is, right? So again, of course, then you start to put your action plan together of prioritizing the processes, and you start to set goals and create your improvement plan. And now you can start to make it into an action plan that has milestones and you're measuring progress. So I think when you get those first 2 tiers solid, you have a quality culture, you have a good strategy and a plan on how you're going to reach your vision. Now you can start to look at what tools and methods make the most sense for you. One of the things I think is really important is creating purpose, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. And then we need to, there's goal setting, and then we can start to use some of the proven methods that we talked about earlier. TQM, making it company-wide, Six Sigma, Lean, SPC. So all the tools that we're familiar with, I still think have a play in this, but now we have a structure that they fit within. And I think it's really important, and this ties back to culture, to create purpose. And you know, Deming's 14 points, one of his 14 points was constancy of purpose, and I think that still really holds true. So people want to be part of things, and so I think you need to understand how to link everything together. And I think literally you need to link everything. There's a kind of a corporate purpose in your vision that you're trying to achieve. That should flow down into team charters, and that should flow down into individual roles and responsibilities. And so from an individual's point of view, he knows how he ties into the team charter and how he ties into the company purpose. And you could go across the you know, from left to right here and understand it works on at the company goals, right? The company goals should flow down to team goals, and the team goals should go down to individual goals, which now that's part of their performance review, right? You're putting those into their performance review. And so everybody understands, and the key part here on the left of it is that there needs to be a feedback loop, right? You look at the results, and if it's not right, you improve. And you know, we do that at the corporate level, we do it at the team level, and we certainly want to do that at the individual level. But if there's not a feedback loop and they don't know what they're missing or where they're not hitting the mark, then we're not giving them the right information, right? So I think that's really important to create purpose, and I think it's not an easy thing to do, but I think it's a very important thing to do. There's a number of ways to set and do goal setting. I like the model that was developed by Victor Baselli and David Weiss, I think when they were working for NASA, called Goals, Questions, Metrics. So if you have your quality vision, now you're going to you want to try and determine what goals are going to help you meet that vision. And so for each goal, you'd try to see what questions need to be answered to help me achieve that goal. And for each question, you need to look at what metrics will help me answer my question. So you put this structure together, and it you know, really looks kind of like a tree chart here. But it's really helpful to put that kind of a structure in place, and then your goals become much more meaningful because they're all tied to something. Again, we're trying to link things together here. So I've done this with spreadsheets. There's probably other tools out there that are easier, but I've done this a number of times with just in a spreadsheet, and it's a good way to communicate with people on what our goals are and what questions we're trying to answer. And it helps you to understand the questions. By understanding the questions, you know what metrics you need to put in place to start to measure. So it's a nice structure, and it's just a suggestion, but like I said, there's other ways to do goal setting. I think training has to be looked at in the broadest sense. So there's lots of kinds of training. And we talked about the management issue that I believe we have. I think we really need to start with management and leadership training for our leaders today. And I think not having that formal training is reflected in some of the culture issues that we have today. So I think teaching people how to treat people and get the most out of people, I think is really important. So I think some management and leadership training is really important. I think when we talk about improvement, we're talking about change. So I think understanding change management, or at least enough to know that there's going to be some resistance to some of the change, and how do you deal with that resistance. So understanding a little bit about change management is important. And then, you know, of course, program management. And then we can start to educate them on our strategy, and our vision, and our goals. And I think it just starts to trickle down there. But I think when you look at training, I think we need to look at training in the broadest sense and attack it from kind of the top down. There's other tools and methods, and again, I know I'm talking to an audience that really understands this, but there are other things as you start to flesh out the details of your plan that you want to put in place with root cause, corrective action. We mentioned GQM, we mentioned cost of quality. So there's a number of tools that we have at our access. I think the key point to me, I think, is to make sure you're using the right tool for the right situation. And then I think we start to have, as you have some success and start to meet your original goals, I think you want to continue that ongoing improvement, right? And that's where continuous improvement kicks in. So you went through your initial round of improvement, and now we start to look at how do we maintain that. So I think, man, there's obviously lots of improvement models that are available, but the difference here is I really think you need to continually reassess your culture. So as you make changes, as people come and go, I think you continually want to reassess your culture and make sure that it's still doing the type of culture that you want to maintain. I think, again, selecting your processes, I think a dollar figure on the impact of the savings that you could have, I think is important, and prioritize things from a business standpoint, I think it's important. I think, again, whatever method you use, I tend to like GQM, but setting your goals, and it's pretty much like most improvement models, right? You're going to map out your processes, you're going to set your as-is state, your current state, and then create a plan, and then continue to optimize it. I think I want to just kind of wrap up with some key points here. So this new model is not intended to replace the old models. It is intended to help enable them. And so I think if you keep that in mind, it's not like trying to replace anything. And I think to really have any sustainable success or sustainable quality, I think you really need to address the culture first. Make sure the culture is ready to embrace change, that the people are engaged and ready to help make things better. Then I think it's important to have a company-wide strategy. I think the book has a whole section on functional quality that talks about how could finance help contribute to quality improvement, how could engineering help contribute to quality improvement. So I think all the groups could really help if they know that they're a part of it. And I think having a company-wide strategy is really important. And then I think putting a cost on some of the poor quality activities starts to shed light on where's the really important areas to start to prioritize. And then just continue to look at how we use our quality practices to reduce cost, and then continue to reassess and improve using the sustainable quality improvement process. My closing thoughts here is that I think the internal drive to improve quality is maintained through a culture of quality. And I really believe that when people collectively feel like they're connected to your success as your business leaders, I think great things could happen. And when you have this type of culture, I think you no longer need to ask for improvement projects. I think they'll start to flow out of the workforce naturally. So with that, I think we have some time for questions, and I also wanted to leave you with my contact information. So please feel free to reach out to me with questions even after this, and if you want to I'm happy to discuss any of these concepts or elements of the book. I'm really looking for the feedback, and I would love to connect with you if you have questions. So I'll turn it back to Don, and I think we start to look at some of the questions, Don.
Thank you very much, Joe, for your presentation. Yes, we do have one question just came in. So about the training, should training for improvement be performed in person with all the different teams, or can be blended with computer-based training?
I think when you're starting out, it would sure be nice, and I think we're in a different environment today. I think it'd sure be nice to do it live, because I think there's a lot of interaction that happens when you do that. But I think for some of when you're starting to get into some of the actual techniques and stuff and things, I think certainly those could be computer-based. But I think when you're really starting to roll out things like your strategy and talking about the vision and goals, I think having that collaboration is really important. And I think we just have to take into consideration that times are a little bit different right now over this last year, so people may be a little bit reluctant to do that.
Thank you. The next question is, how do you insert innovation into your cultural approaches to move the middle, the most mindless wide?
I'm sorry, could you Just repeat the last part of that.
Yes. How do you insert innovation into your cultural approaches to move the needle the most mindness-wise?
I'm not sure I quite understand that. So you're talking about innovation from a product standpoint? How do we build that into there? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so to move the, I guess that was to meddle the most mindness-wise.
Well, I think, let me try to answer it this way. I think if you're really looking for innovation in terms of from new products and new practices kind of thing, I think creating a culture where people feel free and safe to be creative and make suggestions. I think if they're in an environment where they feel like they're going to get shot down, you're not going to get the most creative. You're not going to get the most creative workforce. So I think the culture is important to embrace that people have different opinions and that we welcome your ideas. And I think creating that kind of culture where people feel safe and I think it will allow them to be more creative. Hopefully that will.
Thank you. I'm just going to look at the answer. But there is a next question. How can be an initial strategy to break silos in order to integrate all the players into a team with common goals?
I think that's a really good question. And I think that's where the shared vision comes in place. I think that's a problem for sure in bigger companies, and that's why I think I purposely used the word shared vision, because I think it has to be something that is shared across the company, right? It's not just a vision for one division. It's a shared vision for the entire company, and I think the way you get that buy-in is to include them in the development of that vision. So I think just somebody sitting kind of at the executive level that just comes out with a vision and there's nobody had input into it, I think it's really tough to embrace that. So I think it's really important when you're creating that vision to work with teams to get their input and try and incorporate as much as that into the building that vision so people have buy-in and they feel like they're a part of it and they had a say in it.
Thank you, Job. There is the next question. Is it applicable for all which industry in your model?
Yeah, I actually have thought about that a lot. I do think that the model would work in most industries, and I say that with a little bit of question because I haven't worked in all the industries, right? But I do believe that creating a good work culture is important in any industry, whether it's insurance or pharmaceuticals or whatever it might be. I think that's important because that's where you get the most out of your people, is if they're working in a good culture that they feel like they're valued and listened to. So I think that makes sense across any industry. And I also think that the strategy is important in terms of, I think if by creating a vision and a strategy, I believe that would work across any industry as well. I guess where I start to get a little bit unsure about is like some of the regulated industries and how some of their actions and some of the processes they have are tied to being a little bit more regulated. That, since I don't have experience in those areas, I can't speak too directly. But I think, at least from a culture and strategy standpoint, I think that's transferable.
Thank you. The next question is, what was the most difficult cultural challenge you faced and how did you solve it?
I actually wrote about this in the book. It was one of the things that really it created awareness for me of how tough it is. So I worked at a big company that really had a tough, I'm not going to say the name of the company, but it had a very tough environment. people were very competitive from group to group, were competitive against each other. Literally, people stole ideas from other and took credit for it. There was groups that didn't talk to each other and turned out to be working on very similar products that didn't know each other was working on similar products because there was no communication. So that was the environment I was working in. And in that company, we had an executive came in one day and said, we are going to do Six Sigma projects. Every manager has to do a Six Sigma project. So it became an edict that everybody had to do the assignment. And because it was such a bad culture and everybody was worried about impressing their boss with their deliverables, nobody did them. And they hired in a bunch of black belts, and nobody did the projects. The culture wasn't ready for it. Nothing wrong with the Six Sigma methodology, but the culture was so bad that everybody was just really worrying about either surviving or trying to get out of that environment. So at the time I was running a test organization, what I did to try to get buy-in to what we were doing, because I got a lot of pushback with the ideas that we came up with. And so what I did, and I had my VP that I was working for at the time, we went out on a kind of a road show, and we went and literally sat down with different groups and said, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, what do you think, do you have better ideas? And if they did, we embraced those better ideas. And if they didn't, we tried to get them to take a look at what we were doing. But I will tell you that even though we did that, we got kind of, I would say, average success. I think some of them really turned around and embraced what we were doing and worked with us. And there were some that were just going to be kind of, that's not the way we do it here, and we're going to just keep doing it the way we're doing it. And we never did win those over. So we had kind of, I was a director at the time, so I wasn't, at a senior role, but we tried to work through it, and we just had, mediocre success, to be honest.
Thank you. The next question is the process approach ISO 9001, which will not work for your case.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
I think the question is, it's not working for your case, the process approach of the ISO 9001. Or we can move on to the next question. Six Sigma, is it applicable effectively in project management implementation?
I'm sorry, Six Sigma is
it applicable effectively in project management implementation?
Is it effective project management?
Yes.
I think yes. I think there is a strong project management element within Six Sigma, and I think there's probably people that in this audience that are more of an expert at that than I am. But I do think that in the projects I've been involved with for Six Sigma, there's certainly a project management element of trying to get through the project.
Thank you. The next question is, how have you used these quality and innovation tools to drive service related around the product line or separately?
So most of my companies that I worked in have been product based. We're developing products, but we did have like professional services and some services that go with the products, such as installing and fine tuning and customizing the products for the customers. So I think in those cases, we tried to really understand what the customer's expectations were and tried to help. As a quality person, I worked with the sales team to try and understand what the requirements were. And then we really measured ourselves against those requirements to make sure that we were meeting those actual requirements that the customers said was kind of the minimum requirements they wanted for that service. So it's not as clear cut as products are, but I think there's certainly things that are measurable about service that could be captured and improved on. The other one I would mention is that the other thing that we looked at from a service standpoint was to make it as easy for customers as possible. So if we didn't want them to have to go through a hassle of if they were signing up for some professional services, we wanted to make it as easy for them to come in, sign up for that, and get our services without a bunch of hassle and different things to go through without that just got them frustrated. So we tried to make ease of use a really key point of the service.
Thank you. The next question is, what approach have you found works best? Small team pilots or larger organization? What's the question? Sorry. Or a small team pilots or larger organization initiative to drive the desired change?
That's a good question too. I think ultimately it has to be driven from the top, and again, I'm talking about that shared vision. But I do think that there's real value in doing small pilot projects to really develop the skills for that particular organization, and then try to replicate that. So I think you could do both. I do think that you definitely want to have a shared vision at the top, and of course that means executive support to stand behind that. But I think if you could do some pilot projects to kind of refine your tools and understand the implementation part of it, I think that there's value in that.
Thank you, Joe. So the next question is, do you have any suggestions for new managers in starting a cultural shift? I think going back to the one slide is that I kind of talked a little bit about that, is I think it's really important to assess where you're at. And that could be, you know, as I mentioned, I think if you think you have a culture problem, I think looking at your turnover rate is a really good place to start. But then beyond that, I think really starting to gather data and assessing where you're at. And I think there's ways to do surveys where you could make it really anonymous to the person, so the person feels safe to answer honestly, and start to collect that data. And then you can look at the data to say, here's areas where we need to improve. We have a real cultural issue in this particular area. And I would be glad, if you have questions on that, I would be glad to help you with that. I put together a survey that I think is you know, there's more elaborate ones than what I put together, but those are expensive. So if it's a small company, you know, you want to look at some ways to get out, I'd be glad to help you with that. But I think understanding what the issues are is a really good place to start, and then starting to address those. And you need to figure out if it's if sometimes there's key people that are the issue of the culture, that cause the culture issues, and I think that needs to be identified, and that becomes a leadership issue to address. Thank you. So the next question is, what is one project you have yet to take on that you wish to use these innovation and quality tools on, and what outcomes are you shooting for?
So I think one kind of my next challenge that I would like to do is go to a company that is struggling a bit and try to implement some of these and really see and really work kind of like kind of make a case study out of it. I really would like to go in someplace where they're struggling, and it may be because of culture, maybe of other things, but we really would like to really prove out the model in a company that's struggling, and see if working through some of the concepts from the book would actually help turn them around. I believe that it will, but I would really like the opportunity to try that.
Thank you. So if a new manager could only pull one tool from the quality and innovation toolkit, which one would you select?
I would say focus on leadership and making your people successful. And I think really understanding how to get the most out of your people. I think it's a responsibility of leaders, but I think that if you could make your people successful, that's going to make you successful, right? So what you could do to make them successful, and there's a number of things that we kind of touched on, and I would be glad to talk more offline if anybody's interested. But I think trying to build kind of an environment where people really look up to you, and by saying you're a leader, that implies people are following you, and if people aren't following you, then you're doing something wrong, right? So I think really getting people to buy into what you're doing and they know that you're there to help them be successful. I think that's the most important thing I would take away from it.
Thank you. And I think this one is the last question. So what is one stumbling block that you see time after time, and how do you recommend overcoming it?
I think probably one of the biggest ones is resistance to change. So, coming into a new situation and telling them that you're going to start making changes. Like the example I talked about with the tough company I was at, people just resisted the change, and I think the best way you could get through that, and it's not you can't always get through it. Sometimes you're just not going to be successful. But I think the best chance you have of getting through that is to ease their fears. People are resistant because they're fearing something. Either they're fearing that you're going to make them do something that they don't know how to do, or they fear that you're making them, you're taking something away from them, or whatever the fear may, or you're eliminating their job. So I think really getting into the depth of what their fears are and trying to ease those fears, and then have them. And then I think it's really important to have them be part of the decision making and have input into how the change goes. So I think probably the biggest challenge is that resistance, and it could come at all levels, right? You could have resistance from senior level managers all the way down to the guy that's turning screws on the manufacturing line. I think you need to be able to deal with the resistance at different levels.
Thank you very much, Joe. That was the last question. Thank you very much for your presentation and answering all these questions. And we can conclude our webinar session. I would like to remind everyone that you can find the recording of this webinar on ASQ Innovation Division YouTube channel. Thank you all again for joining this webinar, and have a good evening all.
Okay. Thank you, Don.